Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Affinity's webinar series. I would like to begin by respectfully acknowledging the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which I stand. I pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to all descendants who have cared for this place for a very, very long time. We honour all other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples who are joining us today. My name is Mary Crock and I am Professor of Public Law at the University of Sydney. I am Director of the Sydney Centre for International Law, but I am most importantly a member of the Advisory Board of the Affinity Intercultural Foundation. Now, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, let me briefly introduce you to the Affinity Intercultural Foundation. Affinity was formed by a group of Muslim Australians in the year 2000. The aim of the organisation is to promote multiculturalism and to foster intercultural and interfaith dialogue by building bridges between different groups in society. The impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has affected us all as a global community. In spite of this, Affinity has decided to continue with their events online. The first of these programs began in the month of Ramadan with over 27 daily episodes of Ramadan Conversations, facilitated by the veteran ABC broadcaster John Cleary and TV presenter George Danikian, as well as many distinguished co-hosts, guests and musicians who joined both from within Australia and internationally. We've prepared a little highlight video to show you what happened at that time.
Hello there, and welcome to Ramadan Conversations. We're all in this together.
Yes, fasting is month of sharing, and not just for Muslims as well as non-Muslims.
It's a very big question.
Based information.
And Affinity was extremely good group because it was focusing not on the religious differences, but at what is uniting us.
We're all living.
How do we thrive within this COVID-19 environment?
It's a community mission and everyone has a role to play.
We'll be much happier.
Big cracks at all.
Can I pay tribute to Affinity Intercultural Foundation for your work throughout the community?
I think after a week of my cooking and my wife's cooking, my kids are looking forward to their grandma's cooking.
I'm really proud to say that on the whole, I think as Australians, we've kept our values intact.
And disinformation.
There is a very important correlation between controlling media and the quality of democracy.
Fake journalism.
It didn't become ugly. We held together. And Affinity is part of that spirit and part of that success.
As bystanders.
I'm always inspired by the efforts of Affinity, not just around Ramadan, but certainly then, their dinners, their iftars.
That they desire and be part of all of that is to go for it. Have met with of COVID-19.
I want to thank the Muslim community right across Australia for everything you have been doing and the great example you have been setting and the leadership provided in your community.
As is possible.
Make or break year.
Balancing it.
Duty to reflect on the universe and as a book to read.
Cultural competency. Affinity is part of the furniture now, as far as Australian multiculturalism is concerned.
What's important, but also how we're going to meet future challenges.
It's somewhat different.
Potential for a blessing.
And surely that's a Muslim and a Christian and a Judaic value. A value of collectivity.
The Nobel Peace Prize
is that when we work to complement one another, not the fact that one is better or should be ahead of the other.
More tenuous.
Through meaningful engagement. This very program is just one example.
To weather the storm.
This kind of thing.
1,000 meals a day.
I can't
stress how important iftar dinners and sharing and understanding of Islam has been.
Go Cats!
Follow him for the day.
The symptoms of it.
The fake news
have been established, saying that religiosity can help people to overcome challenges.
Being Australian, there's a lot of good in there.
We work for each other and work with each other.
Muslim fans.
COVID-19 has stressed the need for people to understand each other and to come together.
How do you think? Privacy issues.
To use music. And we would like to give a Roman taste to dialogue and mutual understanding.
Import of the interfaith dialogue in Rome and in Italy at the moment.
Prayer is the joining in cosmic worship.
And
that is the one thing that I have missed.
Subhanallah, Subhanallah.
The night of revelation, it is both a Jewish and Muslim practice for people to stay up all night.
A bit like Martin Luther King Jr. said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
Faith actually has a very positive role to play in making a society very humane.
To love others.
And make them feel welcome.
Let's actually rebuild something better.
I wanted peace in my heart, and I was in peace, and the result of peace was that, I forgave.
I really enjoyed learning about Ramadan, and I'm really, really looking forward to hopefully next year.
Who are we?
The great work that you do.
The sort of approach that Affinity itself has taken. One in which you seek to have a broader understanding of what you believe.
Consequences for our actions.
Actually create.
There's no going back.
There are no barriers between science and faith. They complement one another.
Breaking the ice and building confidence has been really productive.
Believe in different things, you can have a different culture, different skin color, but sports bring people together.
I'm just extending my hand to the Australian Muslim community and demonstrating that we are the same.
This particular conversation about during Ramadan is one that is really, really important.
COVID-19 is an opportunity.
Which I think Affinity and other dialogue centres in our nation have really contributed to.
To find what common values we have, goals, and so it just strengthens us.
The interfaith.
Our culture is based on love and respect.
Which maybe will open the door and create some trust and build a bridge where we can start to talk about the ways that we're different from each other.
Through fasting, we are trying to empathize other people who cannot find what to eat at other times of the year. Empathy.
This is the last of our Ramadan Conversations for 2020. I look forward to catching up again soon. Ramadan Mubarak.
So many friends. You can see all of those episodes on Affinity's YouTube channel, and I would invite you to do that. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce tonight's facilitator, Craig Foster. Craig Foster is an Australian sporting national treasure. Following a distinguished playing career in both Australia and internationally, Craig has had an equally distinguished career as a commentator and is perhaps best known as the chief football analyst for World News Australia on SBS television. Over all of this, and what makes him particularly apt as a moderator for tonight is his remarkable one-man crusade to come to the aid of a young man called Hakim al-Arabi, who was a footballer caught in a three-way political tug of war for his freedom. He was recognised as a refugee in Australia. Craig raised the support of the football community around the world and stirred governments to argue for the release and return of Hakim to Australia when he could have faced prison and torture in a Bahraini prison. The story is told in his recent book, Fighting for Hakim. Most recently, Craig has been outspoken in calls for the sporting organisations to turn their strengths into support for local communities stressed by events of this past year, from the bushfires and then the COVID-19 crisis. Craig Foster is currently an adjunct professor of sport and social responsibility at Torrens University. Craig, I pass the baton to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Crock, Mary, for your warm introduction, though I might say that Don Bradman or perhaps Johnny Warren are true Australian sporting treasures. But it's a lovely sentiment, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. And I must say I thoroughly enjoyed the highlights of recent Affinity video gatherings with community and political leaders, especially with constant terms like inclusion, welcome, shared understanding, rebuild something better. These conversations are so important to promote the concept of togetherness, cross-cultural collaboration, and of breaking down barriers that might otherwise, but should never, exist. Tonight we'll be discussing how UNHCR is meeting the challenges of displacement in 2020. Stay and deliver is the commitment made by UN Refugee Agency staff, whether it's disastrous explosions in Beirut or the threat of coronavirus. And this year's refugees have faced a wave of humanitarian challenges in Yemen, Syria, and of course around the globe. Our distinguished guest this evening, our founding National Director of Australia for UNHCR, Naomi Steer, and Ambassador of Australia for UNHCR, Peter Gould. Naomi Steer is National Director for Australia for UNHCR, which is responsible for the UN Refugee Agency's private sector partnerships in Australia. Her role includes missions to global refugee situations to consult with displaced communities, report back to donors, and identify opportunities for the Australian private sector to directly fund projects. Naomi presents regularly and is widely published on global humanitarian issues, and in particular, the impact of conflict and displacement on women and girls. Naomi is a trustee of First State Super in Australia and a director of the Sydney Financial Forum. Welcome, Naomi. Lovely to have you.
Thanks very much, Craig. Thank you to that lovely introduction from Mary, and thank you to Amit Paulet from Affinity for asking me to be here today. It's very special, and I just love seeing that video of all the amazing things that you've done and the very wonderful network of people supporting you. So very glad to be here tonight as part of that.
Wonderful to have you. As I say, Peter Gould leads a strategic design team based in Sydney, Dubai and Jakarta. Gould Studio embraces a heart-centred approach to design, resulting in meaningful brands and products for positive change. Recent examples include the Salam Sisters brand, inspired by his two daughters, that encourages young girls to dream big. Over nearly 20 years, his clients have included the United Nations, Etihad Airways and Dubai Culture. Peter's personal spiritual journey has been a major influence on his creative work. His vision is to foster a heart-centred design movement that enables cross-cultural understanding and a bright, shared future. Welcome also to you, Peter.
Thanks so much, Craig. Really great to join everyone tonight, and appreciate everyone tuning in. I know it's a busy Tuesday night for a lot of you, so it's just wonderful to get together and share and reflect on some important things happening in the world. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Peter. Perhaps we might start with you, Naomi. Could you kick off the night by telling us about UNHCR's work and its role in supporting refugees?
Thanks, Craig. I suspect quite a few who've joined us tonight know about UNHCR, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. But more broadly in the Australian community, that's probably not the case. So for anyone here tonight, it's probably worth reminding us all that UNHCR is the leading UN refugee agency representing refugees and displaced people. It was started in 1950, and essentially I always find this fascinating. It was to help with the global displacement after the Second World War, and optimistically, it had a 3-year mandate. All the world thought that we would need UNHCR, displacement would be, resolved, and that was the end of that. And of course, 70 plus years later, UNHCR is still here. The work, I think, for UNHCR to sort of yes, one around and so important, and goes to the heart of UNHCR's work, the legal protection of refugees and upholding the protections contained in the Refugee Convention. But the other part of the work that I think people often don't understand is the humanitarian work that UNHCR does. 80% of UNHCR staff are actually working in the field in very remote places, often in conflict situations. And during my 20 years with UNHCR, I've sort of had the privilege of working alongside UNHCR colleagues and supporting their work. The only other thing I'd like to say at this point, it's also, I think, and where Australia for UNHCR comes into it, my organisation, UNHCR only gets 3% of its budget as fixed funding and has to raise the other 97% from voluntary contributions. And of course, historically, a lot of that has come from governments, but increasingly with the politicisation of the refugee issue and geopolitical politics, that funding in a bit, dare I say, like a roller coaster up and down. So about 20 years ago, UNHCR reached out to the private sector and started establishing organisations like mine. We're an independent organisation, but work closely with UNHCR, and our exclusive purpose is raising funds from the private sector to support UNHCR's humanitarian work. There are 7 partners around the world. By the end of this year, there'll be 10. And I think private sector funding now accounts for nearly over 10% of UNHCR's budget, which is quite amazing when you're looking at global operations.
And of course, you set up or founded the Australian arm for UNHCR, didn't you, around 20 years ago or so? So can you just elaborate on what some of the changes are that you've seen in the humanitarian space over that several decades?
Yes, and personally, I should say, when I first set it up, it was just me in an office all by myself. And as I got more and more people, my office got smaller and smaller. And when we first set up, we bought this enormous desk that could serve as both my desk and the board desk. It was all one. And as my office got smaller and smaller, we kept chopping it off. So I was very relieved when we finally moved into new premises and I got a new desk, a couple of ago, and was able to have the board separately. For UNHCR, the changes probably over those 20 years, one in terms of numbers. When I started, I think the figure was 20 million people displaced. Today, we're talking about nearly 80 million people displaced worldwide. And the big change within that, UNHCR as the refugee lead organisation, also deals with displaced people, internally displaced people, who actually make up the majority of that 80 million. So I think the phenomena of the last 2 decades has been internal conflict within countries themselves, pushing people out of their homes and communities. I think the other change I've seen is very much nature of the work, nature of humanitarian situations, if you like. Again, when I first started, you might have a major emergency. Once every 2 or 3 years. That's a large-scale movement of 500,000 people or more across the border. Today, we're dealing with 6 or 7 in 1 year. So again, just that represents the scale. And the other, I guess, salutary fact is, you know, we talk about ourselves as an emergency response organisation, which we very much are, and we've just seen that recently following the Beirut explosion, and UNHCR very much on the ground there. But with refugee situations now often extending for 20 years or more, UNHCR is dealing often in the same country with inflows from immediate emergencies, and then refugees who've been in those same situations for 10, 15 years, 20 years. And that has created, I guess, in a positive way, I would say finally through the Global Refugee Compact, a different way of thinking. For example, and I say when I first started, I couldn't talk about housing, funding housing, because that might denote that refugees are going to be in one's country for some time if you're building a house. So you have to talk about temporary shelter. Well, I think the reality of global displacement has, you know, finally sort of come to the fore with the Refugee Compact. And now UNHCR working with other partners, the World Bank, other big NGOs, working with governments to look much more at longer term solutions. And as refugees often have said to me over the years, yes, we need food, water and shelter, but we need education, we need health, we need livelihoods, you know, we need income, we need a future. And I'm very pleased to see that, you know, there is now this big momentum towards bringing about some of that support also.
Wonderful. Thank you, Naomi. So let's go to Peter now, just on these issues around the Australian arm for UNHCR in particular. Tell us about your journey, can you please, to supporting UNHCR as an ambassador, and you might focus in particular on your fabulous Islamic philanthropy initiative.
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, the story for my involvement goes back a few years when I was actually in the privileged position of being a tourist in Syria. And this is sort of in the mid-2000s before the tragic war that would unfold just a few years after my visit. And it was a time when I was able to, you know, just as an Australian, as a you know, as someone who became Muslim, starting to explore and make connections between you know, this spiritual path, but, you know, this beautiful culture and rich history in a place like Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and others. And in Syria in particular, I was just so drawn to the warmth and the richness of the people, the families that I met, the individuals. The hospitality was just so welcoming and wonderful. And I felt, you know, I was only there really for a few weeks, but it gave me a bit of I think a slice of daily life there, and you know, an impression of what an incredible you know story and the diversity of people there. Of course, in the couple of years after that time, and then now it's coming up to tragically and sadly 10 years since that war started unfolding. And throughout that time, I kept thinking of those families and individuals that I had met and wondering about them and their loved ones. And of course, just those small human connections are a tiny microcosm of the many, many hundreds of thousands of people and millions that have been affected and since displaced. So it's something that just as one individual, it sort of was been on my heart. And as I had spent some more time in Dubai, where you know, some of our projects are, I got to know the UNHCR global team, and particularly very active leading the region. Of course, being very close to Dubai as one of the central hubs for the activities there and helping support people on the ground across the region. As I got to know the team and their activities, I was just so really impressed with the scale of the effort that UNHCR on the ground. Obviously, I'm familiar with the brand, but just when you get to know the individuals and the efforts and the, you know, just incredible responsibility of helping that many families. We also saw those, you know, heartbreaking photos of, you know, masses and massive people displaced. So as I got to know that team there, coming back to Australia, you know, where I live, I thought, this is an organization I would love to just help support in a whatever capacity. As it turns out, there were a lot of great alignment, and I was kindly asked to help, more formalize some of that support. And I've been trying to just link some of our great efforts, building on what Naomi and the team have done, a fantastic effort in the last 2 decades here, and just sharing that with more audiences. So, and part of the event tonight is bridging some of our communities to share that message. So it's really a blessing just to be involved in a small way like this.
Well, you're doing outstanding work. Naomi, can I just come back to you briefly, please, on a point that you made before around the Refugee Compact? Because you talked about, the increase in this issue, whether it's internal migration or external. And of course, now we've got migration in relation to climate change and displaced people, at increasing levels every year, it seems. Around the Refugee Compact that you mentioned, do you see now a genuine a motivation of responsibility internationally across the countries?
Look, I think from UNHCR's perspective, they would say yes, sort of heartened by the response of the international community, perhaps not all. And I think, for example, the United States, which has been a very strong supporter of UNHCR in the past, that's closed resettlement, for example, and there is, not so positive changes there. On the other hand, other countries, the Nordic countries, have stepped up, both in terms of their funding and their commitment to take greater numbers of refugees. So I think overall, from what I hear from UNHCR, it's actually quite positive. And I think part of that message is obviously supporting countries, and it's often the poorest countries with the least resources who take the largest number of refugees. Beirut, for example, or Lebanon has 1.5 Syrian refugees, for example, which, is a very large proportion of their existing population. In Uganda, it's nearly 1 million refugees, Ethiopia. And these are countries that have been very generous, but also need support to continue hosting those populations. And so this message about, okay, we're looking for long-term solutions, returning to one's country doesn't look possible in some cases, for example, Syria for some time. Resettlement, even before COVID, the numbers were really restrictive. So how do we support those host communities and those refugees or displaced people now? And that has actually, I think, really sort of galvanized a lot of action. And I see that, when I go to Uganda, big plans for infrastructure that are going to benefit the host community, but are obviously going to support refugees. Around the COVID crisis, I think it changed the kind of discussion UNHCR might have had once. In the past, refugees and displaced people have been considered in their own basket. So national plans around health or education or whatever have excluded refugees. Because of the discussion arising from the Global Compact, the discussion is about including refugees and displaced people in the national plans. And that's actually been really important for the COVID pandemic preparation and support. So instead of just thinking UNHCR will just sort of deal with that over here, UNHCR is speaking very much to governments about how do we support each other? What are your needs as the government to support both refugees and your population, and getting the support from partners like the World Bank. And again, that's very different from maybe 10 years ago, from how I saw sort of the discussion then.
Yes, the coronavirus pandemic has certainly affected many vulnerable communities and exposed inequities, both in Australia and around the world, and refugee community, if you like, is one of those. There are many fabulous advocates both in Australia and around the world. We have a video question from one of them. He's a very good friend of mine. His name is Dr. Graham Tom, and as you would know, he's the head of refugee policy and advocacy for Amnesty Australia. Let's hear from Graham.
Thanks to the Affinity Intercultural Foundation for hosting this important event tonight. My question is for Naomi. Given that under COVID, countries like Australia have been unable to resettle refugees, some of the most vulnerable refugees from around the world through its humanitarian program, depriving UNHCR of an important durable solution. Do you think at this time Australia should in fact be doing more then to fund the work of UNHCR, particularly in Southeast Asia, for refugees such as the Rohingya who are stuck in camps in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh? Thank you.
And thanks for that question from Graham, who's such an expert himself, I have to say. And it was great to see him last night, I think, on Australian Story and Amnesty's role in supporting Baruchi, who's been resettled in New Zealand. Congratulations to everybody around that. Yes, great question. Thank you. And of course, I would say that, the Australian government's actually been very supportive about humanitarian support, including, and I say that around support for UNHCR's operations in Bangladesh. 2017, Australia for UNHCR actually partnered with the government in raising funds from the private sector, and we ended up raising about $7 million that went to the relief. But of course, given the numbers of people who now support, that's probably never enough. And I have to say that's where I think the private sector has stepped up. I would call on all governments, including the Australian government, to continue supporting UNHCR's humanitarian operations. But in the same way, I call on, individuals and citizens to support us. And, I'm very pleased in Australia that despite the often contentious debate around refugees in this country, that we have over 100,000 donors to UNHCR, which is incredible, really. And I always sort of remind myself, when you think things are looking quite bleak, that there actually is a lot of good in our community, and that's what we must remind ourselves and encourage.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to need at some point those 100,000 plus to get together and continue to make some really substantive change here in many respects. I spoke before about the coronavirus pandemic, because 2020 has been a challenging year for everyone really, but particularly vulnerable communities and organisations like UNHCR who deal with those communities. Let's take another moment now to look at UNHCR's introductory video to see how you've been assisting refugees this year.
Dear refugees,
this coronavirus pandemic endangers everyone.
We are sparing no effort to support you.
Whether we are working from home
or out there with you. From Bangladesh to Iran. To Brazil.
From Ecuador to Colombia. From Jordan to Kenya.
We are working with you
to prevent possible outbreaks.
When we founded Australia for UNHCR, it was very much to meet what we saw a real need, to connect ordinary Australians to the greater cause of UNHCR supporting and protecting refugees. We're an organisation that's used to dealing with emergencies. We're already dealing with large-scale movements of populations from South Sudan into neighbouring countries, continuing flows from Somalia, 1 million people in Bangladesh. And now you have this added complication of necessary preparation for COVID-19.
Especially now during the coronavirus pandemic, we have seen several refugees on the front line, fighting to win the war against this pandemic. So I believe that everyone has a role to play.
Dear refugees,
in this rapidly evolving crisis, we are working with governments to ensure that you are part of the response.
We are increasing access to healthcare and clean water.
We are advocating that your rights are adequately protected.
Together,
we will emerge from this crisis.
We will continue to serve and we're committed to deliver.
We will not give up.
The UN itself is a symbol of hope to so many people like myself. You know, when we fled our country, the first thing that came to our mind was the UN. And we knew that if we reach where there's the United Nations, we'll be able to get food, we'll be able to go to school, and we'll be able to get a place to sleep. And that is what happened exactly when we came to Kakuma.
UNHCR is very much in the position now of not just providing emergency support, but also the much longer term needs of refugees and displaced people. And of course, that goes into the area of education, livelihoods, training, all the things that make our life worth living and having some kind of feasible future.
Education for refugees, particularly for young people, is vitally important to help them keep their lives on track.
The school is more than just a place of learning. When they have a teacher in front of the class, they forgot all the nightmare they went through and they instead think about the future.
Dear refugee,
you teach us what it is to live with uncertainty.
And to hold on to things that matter.
Even as the world turns upside down.
We are in this together.
We are in this together.
For Australia, for UNHCR, we are very much that connection between the support base here and both UNHCR and also the people that we support in the field.
when I was a refugee many years ago, I didn't have clean water or soap. I had rash in my hands, and all I had to wash my hands with was dirty water. There are many refugees right now who need our help.
Together, we can help people less fortunate than us.
A lot of us are complaining that we're all stuck at home, but imagine if you didn't have a home, and imagine if you couldn't wash your hands.
What the pandemic highlights beyond anything is, at the end of the day, it's going to be up to refugees themselves, in our case, to do what they need to do to protect themselves and their families. Our job as a not-for-profit is to give them the necessary resources to enable them to do that.
Wonderful work that the organisation is doing, and both of you. It must take a huge amount of sensitivity and cultural understanding and competence to be able to work in many of these zones in different cultures. Can you both perhaps reflect a little on the importance of diversity in the work that you do, Naomi, and then in your own field as well, Peter, please?
Yes, thanks, Craig. I think diversity across the many spectrums of that is essential to do our work. I have to say, both in Australia for UNHCR, we have a very diverse workplace. 30% of our staff at any one time are refugees from across the board, and it's something that we really treasure and has brought something unique to the organisation. Globally, also UNHCR by its very nature is a very diverse organisation. But I think one of the things that's really developed over the last couple of years is the recognition, of course, that not all refugees or displaced people are homogenous, they are individuals, and I think, from early on, gender, for example, has been a really important area that UNHCR has worked on, given that, 80% of refugees are women and children, ensuring that refugee women have a voice, both in their own community and leadership. And again, compared from years ago, I wouldn't go to any refugee situation and not meet with any women leaders, which wasn't always the case. And there's a lot of planning around that. Issues around, for example, disability, again, a sort of new issue, relatively new issue for many organisations. I say that, you know, like over the last sort of 10 years, this awareness that you need to provide specialist support and identify the needs of people with disabilities, but also to give them a voice in solutions for them in refugee settlements. I would also say when I go to refugee situations now, for example, in Africa, where I travel a lot, incredibly kind of, I don't know how they do it, diverse workforce, you know, from every corner of the African continent. You hear all the different languages and, you know, out of UNHCR uniforms, sort of wonderful content and whatever. But I think what binds everybody together is this sort of a unique mandate that, you know, UNHCR has, and the esprit de corps around supporting the most vulnerable people, and that certainly binds us all together.
Peter?
Yeah, just building on that, I think it's really, especially this year, it's really an opportunity where we're all in the same storm. We might be in different boats, but, you know, especially somewhere like Australia, you know, it's really, there's an Arabic word I was learned called amana, which means like a trust or a gift. And I feel in Australia, we feel that it's such a blessing. We have really a responsibility to serve those, even though it's been, you know, a difficult year for a lot of Australians. You know, if I can share a short story from one of our team members in Beirut, who just within a few hours was there helping out in the blast, just helping you know, clear some of the glass and the devastation, just, you know, people rushing to help. And he related this shared sense of optimism and humanity. And when I called him, that we had a chat the next day, just knowing that people from all the way from Australia, which sometimes feels like a different planet to people, you know, in Beirut, for example, actually not at all. It was really this optimistic sense of appreciation. And I think if actually, you know, a great example is Affinity itself. If I can call out our very kind hosts, look at that video. Look at the video they just shared at the start of this webinar. Phenomenal. That's what we, you know, that at the very least that we can all do individually is just build those one-to-one relationships. I think it can sometimes feel a bit overwhelming when you look at the numbers, when you look at these photos, and we've also at the same time, we've got our mortgage, we've got our kids, we've got life happening to us. I think just one-to-one at the very least, you know, building whatever relationships we can, and just building that sense of shared humanity, and supporting organizations locally like Affinity and Australia for UNHCR. Every dollar helps, every relationship that you can support. That's what the world needs right now. It needs more of that empathy, and just, you know, we've got a great opportunity to transform into that, I think, during and post this COVID shared global experience.
Yes, we do. And talking about donations, I'm sure Affinity and UNHCR and so many organisations around the country, you know, need financial support now. So for those who are watching this either live or on replay on the Affinity YouTube channel, please dig deep. If you've anything to give, then that would be, you know, most welcome. Naomi, Peter was touching on Beirut there. Of course, there's a big Lebanese Australian community. All of us have friends, Lebanese Australians, and everyone was touched by what had occurred in Lebanon. Can you talk to us, please, about the impact that the recent explosion had there on displaced people? I mean, many Lebanese nationals and also refugees.
Yes, and I think, and, you know, I pass on, you know, my sympathy to everybody affected by that dust. And I know, as you say, Craig, many families here in Australia were sort of, you know, had family members and friends, and, you know, Lebanese Australians have such a connection that sort of it's such a bridge between those two countries. For UNHCR, which has operated in Lebanon for decades now, it immediately came out with its pre-positioned supplies, providing support not only to the refugees who were in the vicinity of the blast and affected, but also to the host community. And again, I think we have to acknowledge increasingly, you know, it's people themselves, whether it be refugees or the people who were immediately affected by the bomb blast, who are the first responders. You know, when we saw those images of the communities themselves going in, going through the rubble, and still sort of looking to sort of help support each other. But you know, the key things I think that UNHCR has brought to support are around shelter. I think in the very first couple of weeks, we distributed about 4,100 tents, and the majority of those tents went to the local host community because while refugees were affected, the greater need was the whole community and that support. UNHCR also providing cash assistance. So people were able to actually have immediate funds that they could go and buy what they needed. Of course, you know, dealing with the trauma from the blast, UNHCR ramped up its support around psychosocial support and or augmented medical support, as you know, and other support through the existing Beirut health structures. So, you know, across the board, and it's still working there. I know my own colleagues were actually quite shocked. Some of them had their own houses done in the blast. So I think, as Peter, you've had people, you know, friends and, you know, part of your organisation there. Everybody who was there at the time was so impacted, and UNHCR not immune to it, but has been on the ground every day, provide that much needed support to the community.
Thank you, Naomi. We've got some questions coming in from, I think, the YouTube channel, which is great. We might just go to another video question sent in from Larissa from Sydney first, and I believe this is Naomi.
Refugee crisis in the Middle East is getting worse. Majority of people trapped in those camps are women and children, and unfortunately violence towards women has been escalating. I have two questions to UNHCR. First one, what does UNHCR do to ensure that women and children are safe in refugee camps? And number two, shouldn't this group be prioritized for resettlement in Australia? Thank you.
And thank you for that, Larissa. And again, a great question. And, you know, as we've discussed, you know, because the majority of refugees are women and children, this is a central concern for UNHCR, and the needs of
Seem to have lost Naomi there momentarily. Peter, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine. I think we might have lost Naomi's audio. If I can maybe speak a little on her behalf of, I know what I think she was sharing a little was I think the statistic was something like 80% of refugees globally are women and children, and so Larissa's question was very timely. You know, I know from my interactions with Australia for UNHCR, that's a real priority, and it's very central. And meeting the leadership team within Australia and globally, you have a lot of incredible women leaders like Naomi and others who lead the organization and have great programs that I've seen locally and abroad that really, you know, really directly try to, you know, facilitate, you know, the great mentorship, leadership, and facilitate what they can. For the second question, I'll have to let Naomi answer when she's back on audio, I think. But you can hear me okay, I think, Craig?
That's okay, I can hear you. Yeah, I just wasn't sure if it was just me or if it was Naomi, so I didn't want to jump in, but I'm sure she'll be back momentarily. From your perspective then, and we've talked about Australia, and our historic, certainly recently in the last 20 years, issues around refugees and asylum seekers in particular. What do you think, what would be your messages to Australia at this point in time that they should know about refugees and what they can offer in the community, for example?
Yeah, sure. If you can hear us, feel free to keep sharing. But I mean, the way I'd answer that, Craig, is it's really about empathy. I mean, this year, if anything, we've all experienced is sudden hardship. Suddenly, barriers were put up, restrictions on us. Plans that we had were interrupted. Travel plans were abandoned, and we had perhaps a tiny slice or a glimpse into that. The hard reality of there's only so much that we can control, but looking at if anything we've learned that difficulty I hope for definitely for myself is thinking about those that's their lived experience for their whole lives. I mean at a much deeper, more powerful and honestly devastating level, being stuck in positions where they're unable to move, being displaced. I mean I think there's we can all just have more empathy, and taking a little bit more time, and whether that's just getting to know our neighbors, hearing our stories a little more, but just looking at, as I've come to know personally more now with the great efforts of Australia for UNHCR, they've put out some great really human, beautiful stories about these connections, individual lives and families that they've helped. And knowing that we can all support that effort, even whatever we can do in different ways, we can contribute that. And on the other side, knowing that, we're helping someone, in some way. It's something we can all do.
Yes, something that we can all do. Oh, Naomi, we have you back, yes.
But you're back. Welcome back.
Welcome back.
I made a very interesting contribution that no one heard, but just joking.
Sure
Apologies to everyone. So, yeah.
Peter very ably. Yes, of course it does. Peter very, and I let you talk there for at least 2 minutes with no voice. I was just hoping that it was coming through somewhere on the system.
Sorry,
yeah, that's
everyone.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's okay, no problem. So we've got a few more questions to get through. Peter very ably finished that question on your behalf, Naomi. We might just go to another video. No, that's right. So we've got a video question here from Rose.
Hello, panel. As a mental health clinician, mental health has been a major topic during this pandemic of isolation and restrictions. My question is, how does it relate to mental health of our refugees? Thank you.
Well, if you can hear me, and hold up your hand if I just go away again, and then I'll just stop. But yes, look, mental health, and it's one of those issues like disability and gender that, for a long time wasn't on the radar, I would say, more broadly, because the needs really were seen so great. But it definitely is now. The challenge is, I can go into a refugee situation where I have, and sort of coming back to the issue of women, and where, in one refugee camp I went, over 50% of the women had suffered some kind of sexual assault and were quite traumatised. There was one psychiatrist available who came every 4 months for a camp of 60,000 people. Clearly inadequate. What the women did in that case, and it's sort of, often I've seen it, they just sort of spontaneously came together in groups to help that healing through just the support of women themselves. And that is important. but we actually need to be providing sort of much better help than that. As I might have mentioned, or I don't know if people heard, but when I was talking about the situation in Beirut, you know, that was very much top of the list to look at, you know, the needs of people who've been through this incredibly traumatic experience. So ramping up psychosocial support and making that available. But I would have to say, generally in my experience, you know, across refugee situations, there just aren't the resources to provide for that right now. And what I would say is also, you know, you see many refugees again, and refugee women are prioritised through a special program for resettlement in Australia. So when resettlement starts again, there is a special program specifically for vulnerable women who will be here. But often I've spoken to health services here in Australia who've said, you know, they're dealing with trauma from what's happened back in Congo or South Sudan or whatever, where women and girls have spent years and years in refugee camps where there hasn't been that opportunity to sort of sort those and support those women in the way they should have. So I think that increasingly will be a focus both of Australia for UNHCR, but sort of the humanitarian sector more generally, as we appreciate it's not just sort of physical needs, but it's also mental health needs that are so vital for your well-being.
Absolutely. Let's turn now in the couple of minutes that we have left, and thank you so much, both of you, for all your time. Our good friend and cousin Ahmed Polat is that we might be able to go just a minute, 60 seconds or two later, which I'm delighted by. So we've got a couple of really good questions here. Naomi, these go, you know, to the heart of UNHCR's work. So I'd imagine, you know, they'll be targeted to you. Someone has asked, how can UNHCR urge governments to increase refugee quotas for displaced persons, refugees? And in particular, how can civil society help?
Mm-hmm. And again, a great question. I mean, I think civil society can help in many ways in Australia, and there's obviously not just Australia for UNHCR. There are many advocacy groups in Australia. Amnesty, we've seen Graham Tom, you know, the International Resettlement Service, just to, you know, name a few in our own backyard. And they both as organisations are constantly, you know, lobbying government to expand the humanitarian quota for refugees and asylum seekers. But also I think it's really important as citizens that we actually write to our local members, that we say this is an important issue for us, that we make our voices heard around that. I don't think you can estimate the impact of that on your local member or whatever, because otherwise it is just seen as an invisible issue that only a minority care about. So I think you should definitely be raising your voice and going to local members. That being said, from where I am at Australia for UNHCR, even if we doubled the humanitarian intake in Australia, there's still so many displaced globally, millions and millions and millions. And I can go to a refugee camp like Dadaab, where I was last year, 300,000 people, or up in the north of Uganda with 200,000 people. And the majority of those people will never get resettled. And I have to say, you know, for a lot of people, they just want security, safety. They would, you know, their preference would be to return home in safety. But, you know, my sort of, I guess, put up the challenge is to actually help those millions of people who, you know, have hope and have meaningful lives, dare I say, you know, often in like really inadequate circumstances. So I think resettlement is of course one of the most important ways, but I know there are so many vulnerable people, and it's the most vulnerable who get to, if there's a list, the top of the list for resettlement, but that still leaves this vast number of refugees who need some very other kind of substantive long-term support.
Yes, thank you, Naomi, and thank you, Peter, as well, both of you, for the generosity with your time. It's certainly a problem that the world needs to come to terms with, and that every country and all of us as citizens of Australia and global citizens need to ensure that we solve this problem going forward. It's just simply not right. So we could talk again for another hour, and I certainly hope that we do. We've got a bunch of wonderful questions here from the community as well. Let's do this again, shall we? Thank you both for your time. And I'm going to turn now to end the night, Affinity's Executive Director, Mr. Ahmet Polat, to present the concluding remarks. Thank you both.
Thank you, my esteemed cousin Craig. Tonight has been another successful event. Great speakers, great topic, and great questions. Affinity has been honored to host a vast array of speakers tonight in collaboration with the distinguished institution UNHCR. Thank you, cousins Naomi, Peter, and Craig, for your valuable input, not only tonight, but for your contributions to our wider society. I'd also thank Matt Levinson and Matthew Phillips for their work behind the scenes. My deepest gratitude to our valuable advisory board member, Professor Mary Crock, for her welcome speech, but also for her great involvement with refugees. As of us have virtually gathered here tonight, we all join the global community in showing our support for the millions of refugees around the world. Now, more than ever, our obligation to help and support those in need takes on added meaning this year as our neighbors and communities face sickness, grief, economic hardship, and self-isolation. Around 1 month ago, all of us learned with deep grief the news of explosion in Beirut that killed more than 100 people, injured thousands, and caused hundreds of thousands to leave their homes. I extend my condolences to those who lost their loved ones in the explosion and to all Lebanon people. It is distressing to see that the refugee crisis is getting worse each day and that millions of families are torn apart, especially now with the added hardship of COVID-19. I pray all conflicts in this world are eliminated so that no one should have to flee their homes to feel safe. May God give all those who have been displaced strength and perseverance to build a new life for themselves, their families, and their communities. Our responsibility to ensure we open our hearts to everyone, regardless of what part of the world they come from. We should all strive to ensure that refugees come in our communities. Each speaker tonight are valuable and remarkable assets for our dynamic multicultural Australian society and are star role models with their contributions to the global society. Cousin Naomi has been actively on the front line with UNHCR and for 20 years has shown great leadership and advocacy for justice for all. My cousin Peter, who is truly quite humble, has great visionary and continues to provide cross-cultural understanding for a greater future. My esteemed cousin Craig, my admirable cousin, knows no limits to help people from all walks of life and humanity with. Like tonight, Affinity has hosting many events over the past weeks to contribute to the Australian society, and it's continuing to bring a new webinar episode each week this year. Next Thursday, 17 September, Affinity, Australian Human Rights Commission, and PwC Australia will be hosting the webinar Valuing Diversity in Leadership. Race Discrimination Commissioner Chin Tan and CEO of PwC Australia, Tim Seymour, will be in conversation with senior reporter ABC News, my cousin Philippa McDonald. I also like to share with you my cousin Leanne Smith's upcoming event. This Thursday, 10 September at 12:30 p.m., the Whitlam Institute will be hosting the webinar, Reimagining Our Foreign Policy, in conversation with Penny Wong, and will discuss the future of Australia's place in the world with Director of Whitlam Institute, Leanne Smith. For more information, please visit their webpage. We look forward to hosting you next Thursday evening. Thank you all and have a good night. Thank you.